Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Story Time. I'm Tori, the host of Ready to Be Romanced. And today we are going to be reading chapters 3 and 4 of A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. I covered chapters 1 and 2 on my last live. You can find that on my Reels or my YouTube channel. And I covered the book, A Court of Thorns and Roses, on my new podcast, Ready to Be Romanced, available wherever podcasts are found. So we're going to start with chapter 3. If you have any questions or comments or thoughts about this chapter, weigh in. I'd love to chat about it. So let's begin. The trampled snow coating the road into our village was speckled with brown and black from passing carts and horses. Elaine and Nesta clicked their tongues and grimaced as we made our way along it, dodging the particularly disgusting parts. I knew why they'd come. They'd taken one look at the hides I'd folded into my satchel and grabbed their cloaks. I didn't bother talking to them, as they hadn't deigned to speak to me after last night, though Nesta had awoken at dawn to chop wood. Probably because she knew I'd be selling the hides at the market today and would go home with money in my pocket. They trailed me down the lone road, winding through the snow-covered fields, all the way into our ramshackle village. The stone houses of the village were ordinary and dull, made grimmer by the bleakness of winter. But it was market day, which meant the tiny square in the center of the town would be full of whatever vendors had braved the brisk morning. From a block away, the scent of hot food wafted by, spices that tugged on the edges of my memory, beckoning. Elaine let out a low moan behind me. Spices, salt, sugar, rare commodities for most of our village, impossible for us to afford. If I did well at the market, perhaps I'd have enough to buy us something delicious. I opened my mouth to suggest it, but we turned the corner and nearly stumbled into one another as we halted. "May the immortal light shine upon thee, sisters," said the pale-robed young woman directly in our path. Nesta and Elaine clicked their tongues. I stifled a groan. Perfect. Exactly what I needed to have the children of the blessed in town on market day, so distracting and riling everyone. The village elders usually allowed them to stay for only a few hours, but the sheer presence of the fanatic fools who still worship the high fae made me edgy. Long ago, the high fae had been our overlords, not gods. And they certainly hadn't been kind. The young woman extended her moon-white hands in a gesture of greeting, a bracelet of silver bells, real silver, tinkling at her wrist. Have you a moment to spare so that you might hear the word of the blessed?" "No," Nesta sneered, ignoring the girl's hands and nudging Elaine into a walk. "We don't." The young woman's unbound dark hair gleamed in the morning light, and her clean, fresh face glowed as she smiled prettily. There were 5 other acolytes behind her, young men and women both, their hair long, uncut, all scanning the market beyond the young folk to pester. "It would take but a minute," the woman said, stepping into Nesta's path. It was impressive, truly impressive, to see Nesta go ramrod straight, to square her shoulders and look down her nose at the young acolyte, a queen without a throne. "Go spew your fanatic nonsense to some ninny. You'll find no converts here." The girl shrank back, a shadow flickering in her brown eyes. I reined in my wince. Perhaps not the best way to deal with them, since they could become a true nuisance if agitated. Nesta lifted a hand, pushed down the sleeve of her coat to show the iron bracelet there. The same one Elaine wore. They'd bought matching adornments years ago. The acolyte gasped, eyes wide. "You see this?" Nesta hissed. Taking a step forward, the acolyte retreated a step. This is what you should be wearing, not some silver bells to attract those fairy monsters. How dare you wear that vile affront to our immortal friends? Go preach in another town, Nesta spat. 2 plump and pretty farmers' wives strolled past their way to the market, arm in arm. As they neared the acolytes, their faces twisted with identical expressions of disgust. Fairy-loving whore, one of them hurled at the young woman. I couldn't disagree. The acolytes kept silent. The other villager, wealthy enough to have a necklace of braided iron around her throat, narrowed her eyes, her upper lip curling back from her teeth. Don't you idiots understand what those monsters did to us for all those centuries? What they still do for sport when they can get away with it? You deserve the end you'll meet at fairy hands. Fools and whores, all of you. Nesta nodded her agreement to the women as they continued on their way. We turned back to the women, the young woman, still lingering before us, and even Elaine frowned in distaste. But the young woman took a breath, her face again becoming serene, and said, I lived in such ignorance too, until I heard the word of the blessed. I grew up in a village so similar to this, so bleak and grim. But not 1 month ago, a friend of my cousin went to the border as our offering to Perithian, and she has not been sent back. Now she dwells in riches and comfort as a high-fae's bride, and so might you, if you were to take a moment to. She was likely Eden, Nesta said. That's why she hasn't returned. Or worse, I thought, if a high fae truly was involved in spiriting a human into Perithian. I'd never encountered the cruel, human-looking fae who ruled Perithian itself, or the fairies who occupied their lands, with their scales and wings and long, spindly arms that could drag you deep, deep beneath the surface of a forgotten pond. I didn't know which would be worse to face. The acolyte's face tightened. Our benevolent masters would never harm us. Perithian is a land of peace and plenty. Should they bless you with their attention, you'd be glad to live amongst them. Nesta rolled her eyes. Elaine was shooting glances between us and the market ahead, to the villagers now watching too. Time to go. Nesta opened her mouth again, but I stepped between them and ran an eye along the girl's pale blue robes, the silver jewelry on her, and the utter cleanliness of her skin. Not a mark or smudge to be found. You're fighting an uphill battle, I said to her. A worthy cause. The girl beamed beautifully. Girl, Sarah J. Maas with her words. I can't. Okay. I gave Nesta a gentle push to get her walking and said to the acolyte, no, it's not. I could feel the acolyte's attention still fixed on us as we strode into the busy market square, but I didn't look back. They'd be gone soon enough, off to preach in another town. We'd have to take the long way out of the village to avoid them. When we were far enough away, I glanced over her shoulder at my sisters. Elaine's face remained set in a wince, but Nesta's eyes were stormy, her lips thin. I wondered if she'd stomp back to the girl and pick a fight. Not my problem, not right now. I'll meet you here in an hour, I said. I didn't give them time to cling to me before slipping into the crowded square. It took me 10 minutes to contemplate my 3 options. There were my usual buyers, the weathered cobbler and the sharp-eyed clothier who came to our market from a nearby town, and then the unknown, a mountain of a woman sitting on the lip of our broken square fountain without any cart or stall, but looking like she was holding court nonetheless. The scars and weapons on her marked her easily enough, a mercenary. I could feel the eyes of the cobbler and the clothier on me, sense their feigned disinterest as they took in the satchel I bore. Fine, it would be that sort of day then. I approached the mercenary, whose thick, dark hair was shorn to her chin. Her tan face seemed hewn of granite, and her black eyes narrowed slightly at the sight of me. Such interesting eyes, not just one shade of black, but many, with hints of brown that glimmered amongst the shadows. I pushed against the useless part of my mind, the instincts that had me thinking about color and light and shape, and kept my shoulders back as she assessed me as a potential threat or employer. The weapons on her, gleaming and wicked, were enough to make me swallow and stop a good 2 feet away. I don't barter goods for my services, she said, her voice clipped with an accent I'd never heard before. I only accept coin. A few passing villagers tried their best not to look too interested in our conversation, especially as I said, then you'll be out of luck in this sort of place. She was massive, even sitting down. What is your business with me, girl? She could have been aged anywhere from 25 to 30, but I suppose I looked like a girl to her in my layers, gangly from hunger. I have a wolf pelt and a doe hide for sale. I thought you might be interested in purchasing them. You steal them? No. I held her stare. I hunted them myself, I swear it. She ran those dark eyes down me again. How? Not a question, a command. Perhaps someone who had encountered others who did not see vows as sacred, words as bonds, and had punished them accordingly. So I told her how I'd brought them down, and when I'd finished, she flicked a hand toward my satchel. Let me see. I pulled out both carefully and folded the hides. You weren't lying about the wolf's size, she murmured. Doesn't seem like a fairy, though. She examined them with an expert eye, running her hands over and under. She named her price. I blinked, but stifled the urge to blink a second time. She was overpaying by a lot. She looked beyond me, past me. I'm assuming those 2 girls watching from across the square are your sisters. You all have that brassy hair and that hungry look about you. Indeed, they were still trying their best to eavesdrop without being spotted. I don't need your pity. No, but you need my money, and the other traders have been cheap all morning. Everyone's too distracted by those calf-eyed zealots bleeding across the square. She jerked her chin toward the children of the blessed, still ringing their silver bells and jumping into the path of anyone who tried to walk by. The mercenary was smiling faintly when I turned back to her. Up to you, girl. Why? She shrugged. Someone once did the same for me and mine, and at the time when we needed the most. Figure it's time to repay what's due. I watched her again, weighing. My father has some wood carvings that I could give you as well, to make it more fair. I travel light and have no need for them. These, however, she patted the pelts in her hands, save me the trouble of killing them myself. I nodded, my cheeks heating as she reached for the coin purse heavy in her coat. It was full and weighed down with at least silver, possibly gold, if the clinking was any indication. Mercenaries tended to be well paid in our territory. Our territory was too small and poor to maintain a standing army to monitor the wall with Prythian, and we villagers could rely only on the strength of the treaty forged 500 years ago. But the upper class could afford hired swords like this woman to guard their lands bordering the immortal realm. It was an illusion of comfort, just as the markings on our threshold were. We all knew, deep down, that there were nothing to be done against the fairies. We'd been told it, regardless of our class or rank, from the moment we were born, the warnings sung to us while we rocked in cradles. The rhymes chanted in schoolyards. One of the high fae could turn your bones to dust from 100 yards away. Not that my sisters or I had ever seen it. But we still tried to believe that something, anything, might work against them if we were ever to encounter them. There were 2 stalls in the market catering to those fears, offering up charms and baubles and incantations and bits of iron. I couldn't afford them, and if they did indeed work, they would buy us only a few minutes to prepare ourselves. Running was futile, so was fighting, but Nesta and Elaine still wore their iron bracelets whenever they left the cottage. Even Isaac had an iron cuff around one wrist, always tucked under his sleeve. He'd once offered to buy me one, but I'd refused. It had felt too personal, too much like payment, too permanent a reminder of whatever we were and weren't to each other. The mercenary transferred the coins to my waiting palm, and I tucked them into my pocket, their weight as heavy as a millstone. There was no possible chance that my sisters hadn't spotted the money, no chance they weren't already wondering how they might persuade me to give them some. "Thank you," I said to the mercenary, trying and failing to keep the bite from my voice as I felt my sisters sweep closer, like vultures circling a carcass. The mercenary stroked the wolf pelt, a word of advice from one hunter to another. I lifted my brows. Don't go far into the woods. I wouldn't even get close to where you were yesterday. A wolf this size would be the least of your problems. More and more, I've been hearing stories about those things slipping between the walls. A chill spider walked down my spine. Are they going to attack? If it were true, I'd find a way to get my family off our miserable, damp territory and head south. Head far from the invisible wall that bisected our world before they could cross it. Once, long before and for millennia before that, we had been slaves to high fae overlords. Once we had built them glorious, sprawling civilizations from our blood and sweat, built them temples to their feral gods. Once we rebelled across every land and territory. The war had been so bloody, so destructive, that it took 6 mortal queens crafting the treaty for the slaughter to cease on both sides and for the wall to be constructed. The north of our world conceded to the high fae and fairies who took their magic with them. The south to we cowering the south to we cowering mortals, forever forced to just to scratch out a living from the earth. No one knows what the fae are planning, the mercenary said, her face like stone. We don't know if the High Lord's leash on their beasts is slipping, or if these are targeted attacks. I guarded for an old nobleman who claimed it had been getting worse these past 50 years. He got on a boat south 2 weeks ago and told me I should leave if I was smart. Before he sailed off, he admitted that he'd had word from one of his friends that in the dead of the night, a pack of Martaks crossed the wall and tore half his village apart. Martaks? I breathed. I knew that there were different types of fairies, that they varied as much as any other species of animal, but I knew only a few by name. The mercenary's night dark eyes flickered. Body big as a bear's, head something like a lion's, and 3 rows of teeth sharper than a shark's. And meaner than all 3 put together. They left the villagers in literal ribbons, and the nobleman said. My stomach turned. Behind us, my sisters seemed so fragile, their pale skin so infinitely delicate and shreddable. Against something like the Martaks, we'd never stand a chance. Those children of the blessed were fools, fantastic fools. So we don't know what all these attacks mean, the mercenary said. Other than more hires for me and you keeping well away from the wall, especially if the high fae start turning up, or worse, one of the high lords. They would make the Martaks seem like dogs. I studied her scarred hands, chapped from the cold. Have you ever faced another type of fairy? Her eyes shuddered. You don't want to know, girl. Not unless you want to be hurling up your breakfast. I was indeed feeling ill and jumpy. Was it deadlier than the Martax, I dared to ask? The woman pulled back the sleeve of her heavy jacket, revealing a tanned, muscled forearm, flecked with gruesome, twisted scars. The arc of them so similar to... Didn't the brute force or size of a Martax, she said, but didn't have the brute force or size of a Martax, she said, but its bite was full of poison. 2 months ago, that's how long I was down. 4 months until I had the strength to walk again. She pulled up the leg of her trousers. Beautiful, I thought, even as the horror of it writhed in my gut. Against her tanned skin, the veins were black, solid black, spider-webbed and creeping like frost. Healer said there was nothing to be done for it, that I'm lucky to be walking with the poison still in my legs. Maybe it'll kill me one day, maybe it'll cripple me, but at least I'll go knowing I killed it first. The blood in my own veins seemed to chill as she lowered the cuff of her pants. If anyone in the square had seen, no one dared to speak about it or to come closer. And I'd had enough for one day. So I took a step back, steadying myself against what she told me and showed me. Thanks for the warnings, I said. Her attention flicked back behind me, and she gave a faintly amused smile. Good luck. Then a slender hand clamped onto my forearm, dragging me away. I knew it was Nesta before I even looked at her. They're dangerous, Nesta hissed, her fingers digging into my arm as she continued to pull me from the mercenary. Don't go near them again. I stared at her for a moment, then at Elaine, whose face had gone pale and tight. Is there something I need to know? I asked quietly. I couldn't remember the last time Nesta had tried to warn me about anything. Elaine was the only one she bothered to really look after. They're brutes and will take any copper they can get, even if it's by force. I glanced at the mercenary who was still examining her new pelts. She robbed you? Not her, Elaine murmured. Some other one who passed through. We had only a few coins and he got mad, but why didn't you report him or tell me? What could you have done? Nesta sneered, challenged him to a fight with your bow and arrows. And who in this sewer of a town would even care if we reported anything? What about your Thomas Mandray? I said coolly. Nesta's eyes flashed, but a moment behind me caught her eye, and she gave me what I supposed was her attempt at a sweet smile. Probably as she remembered the money I now carried. Your friend is waiting for you. I turned. Indeed, Isaac was watching from across the square, arms crossed as he leaned against the building. Though the eldest son of the only well-off farmer in our village, he was still lean from the winter, and his brown hair had turned shaggy. Relatively handsome, soft-spoken, and reserved, but with a sort of darkness running beneath it. All that had drawn us together, that shared understanding of how wretched our lives were and would always be. We'd vaguely known each other for years, since my family had moved to the village, but I had never thought much about him until we'd wound up walking down the main road together one afternoon. We'd only talked about the eggs he was bringing to the market, and admired the variation in colors within the basket he bore, browns and tans and the palest blues and greens. Simple, easy, perhaps a bit awkward, but he'd left me at my cottage feeling not quite so alone. A week later, I pulled him into the decrepit barn. He'd been my first and only lover in the 2 years since. Sometimes we'd meet every night for a week. Others we'd go a month without setting eyes on each other. But every time was the same, a rush of shedding clothes and shared breaths and tongues and teeth. Occasionally we'd talk, or rather he'd talk, about the pressures and burdens his father placed on him. Often we wouldn't say a word the entire time. I couldn't say our lovemaking was particularly skilled, but it was still a release, a reprieve, a bit of selfishness. There was no love between us and never had been, at least what I assumed people meant when they talked about love. Yet part of me had sunk when they'd said he would be married. I wasn't yet desperate enough to ask him to see me after he wed. Isaac inclined his head in a familiar gesture, then ambled off down the street, out of town to the ancient barn where he would be waiting. We were never inconspicuous about our dealings with each other, but we did take measures to keep it from being too obvious. Nesta clicked her tongue, crossing her arms. I do hope you two are taking precautions. It's a bit late to pretend to care, I said. But we were careful. Since I couldn't afford it, Isaac himself took the contraceptive brew. Which is like literally the funniest thing ever. Okay. He knew I wouldn't have touched him otherwise. I reached into my pocket, drawing out a 20-mark copper. Elaine sucked in a breath, and I didn't bother to look at either of my sisters as I pushed it into her palm and said, I'll see you at home. Later, after another dinner of venison, when we were all gathered around the fire for the quiet hour before bed, I watched my sisters whispering and laughing together. They'd spent every copper I'd given them, on what, I didn't know, though Elaine had brought back a new chisel for our father's wood carving. The cloak and boots they'd whined about the night before had been too expensive. But I hadn't scolded them for it, not when Nesta went out a second time to chop more wood without my asking. Mercifully, they'd avoided another confrontation with the children of the blessed. My father was dozing in his chair, his cane laid across his gnarled knee. As good as time as any to broach the subject of Thomas Mandray with Nesta. I turned to her, opening my mouth, but there was a roar that half deafened me, and my sisters screamed as snow burst into the room and an enormous, growling shape appeared in the doorway. Okay, chapter 4. I didn't know how the wooden hilt of my hunting knife had gotten into my hand. The first few moments were a blur of the snarling of a gigantic beast with golden fur, the shrieking of my sisters, the blistering cold cascading into the room, and my father's terror-stricken face. Not a Martax, I realized, though the relief was short-lived. The beast has to be as large as a horse, and while his body was somewhat feline, his head was distinctly wolfish. I didn't know what to make of the curled elk-like horns that protruded from his head, but lion or hound or elk, there was no doubting the damage his black, dagger-like claws and yellow fangs could inflict. Had I been alone in the woods, I might have let myself be swallowed by fear, might have fallen to my knees and wept for a clean, quick death. But I didn't have the room for terror, wouldn't give it an inch of space, despite my heart's wild pounding in my ears. Somehow, I wound up in front of my sisters, even as the creature reared onto its hind legs and bellowed through a mouth full of fangs. Murderers! And it was another word that echoed through me. Fairy. Those ridiculous words on our threshold were as good as cobwebs against him. I should have asked the mercenary how she'd killed that fairy, but the beast's thick neck, that looked like a good home for my knife. I dared to glance over my shoulder. My sisters screamed, kneeling against the wall of the hearth. My father crouched in front of them. Another body for me to defend. Stupidly, I took a step forward to the fairy, keeping the table between us, fighting the shaking in my hand. My bow and quiver were across the room, past the beast. I'd have to get around him to reach the ash arrow, and buy myself enough time to fire it. Murderers! The beast roared again, hackles raised. Please, my father babbled from behind me, failing to find it in himself to come to my side. Whatever we have done, we did so unknowingly, and We didn't kill anyone, Nesta added, choking on her sobs, arm lifted over her head, as if that tiny iron bracelet would do anything against the creature. I snatched another dinner knife off the table, the best I could do unless I found a way to the quiver. Get out, I snapped at the creature, brandishing the knives before me. No iron in sight that I could use as a weapon, unless I chucked my sister's bracelets at him. Get out and be gone. With my trembling hands, I could barely keep my grip on the hilts. A nail. I'd take a damned iron nail if it were available. He bellowed at me in response, and the entire cottage shook, the plates and cups rattling against one another. But it left his massive neck exposed. I hurled my hunting knife. Fast. So fast I could barely see it. He slashed it with a paw, sending it skittering away as he snapped to my face with his teeth. I leapt back, almost stumbling over my cowering father. The fairy could have killed me. Could have. Yet the lunge had been a warning. Nesta and Elaine, weeping, prayed to whatever long-forgotten gods might still be skulking about. Who killed him? The creature stalked towards us. He set a paw on the table, and it groaned beneath him. His claws thudded as they embedded in the wood one by one. I dared another step forward as the beast stretched his snout over the table to sniff at us. His eyes were green and flecked with amber. Not animal eyes, not with their shape and their coloring. My voice was surprisingly even as I challenged, "Killed who?" He growled, low and vicious, "The wolf," he said, and my heart stumbled a beat. The roar was gone, but the wrath lingered, perhaps even traced with sorrow. Elaine's wail reached a high-pitched shriek. I kept my chin up. A wolf? A large wolf with a gray coat, he snarled in response. Would he know if I lied? Fairies couldn't lie. All mortals knew that. But could they smell lies on human tongues? We had no chance of escaping this through fighting, but there might be other ways. If I was mistakenly killed, I said, if it was mistakenly killed, I said to the beast as calmly as I could, what payment could we offer in exchange? This was all a nightmare, and I'd awaken in a moment beside the fire, exhausted from my day at the market and my afternoon with Isaac. The beast let out a bark that could have been a bitter laugh. He pushed off the table to pace in a small circle before the shattered door. The cold was so intense that I shivered. The payment you must offer is the one demanded by the treaty between our realms. For a wolf? I retorted, and my father murmured my name in warning. I had vague memories of being read the treaty during my childhood lessons, but could recall nothing about wolves. The beast whirled on me. Who killed the wolf? I stared into those jade eyes. I did. Yikes. He blinked and glanced at my sisters, then back at me, at my thinness, no doubt seeing only frailness instead. Surely you lie to save them. We didn't kill anything, Elaine wept. Please, please spare us. Nesta hushed her sharply through her own sobbing, but pushed Elaine farther behind her. My chest caved in at the sight of it. My father climbed to his feet, grunting at the pain in his leg as he bobbled, but before he could limp toward me, I repeated, I killed it. The beast who had been sniffing at my sisters studied me. I squared my shoulders. I sold its hide at the market today. If I had known it was a fairy, I wouldn't have touched it. Liar, he snarled. You knew. You would have been more tempted to slaughter it had you known it was one of my kind. True, true, true. Can you blame me? Did it attack you? Were you provoked? I opened my mouth to say yes, but no, I said, letting out a snarl of my own. But considering all that your kind has done to us, considering what your kind still likes to do to us, Even if I had known beyond a doubt, it was deserved. Better to die with my chin held high than groveling like a cowering worm. Even his answering growl was the definition of wrath and rage. The firelight shone up upon his exposed fangs, and I wondered how they'd feel on my throat, and how loudly my sisters would scream before they too died. But I knew, with a sudden uncoiling clarity, that Nesta would buy Elaine time to run. Not my father, whom she resented with her entire steely heart. Not me, because Nesta had always known and hated she and I were two sides of the same coin, and that I could fight my own battles. But Elaine, the flower grower, the gentle heart, Nesta would go down swinging for her. It was that flash of understanding that had me angling my remaining knife at the beast. What is the payment the treaty requires? Let's try that again. What is the payment the treaty requires? His eyes didn't leave my face as he said, a life for a life. Any unprovoked attacks on fairy kind by humans are to be paid only by a human life in exchange. My sisters quieted their weeping. The mercenary in town had killed a fairy, but had attacked her first. I didn't know, I said, didn't know about that part of the treaty. Fairies couldn't lie, and he spoke plainly enough, no word twisting. Most of you mortals have chosen to forget that part of the treaty, he said, which makes punishing you far more enjoyable. My knees quaked. I couldn't escape this, couldn't outrun this, couldn't even try to run since he blocked the way to the door. Do it outside, I whispered, my voice trembling. Not here. Not where my family would have to wash away my blood and gore, if he even let them live. The fairy huffed a vicious laugh. Willing to accept your fate so easily? When I just stared at him, he said, for having the nerve to request where I slaughter you, I'll let you in on a secret, human. Prythian must claim your life in some way for the life you took from it. So as a representative of the immortal realm, I can either gut you like a swine, or you can cross the wall and live out the remainder of your days in Prythian. I blinked. What? He said slowly, as if I were indeed as stupid as a swine. You can either die tonight or offer your life to Prythian by living in it forever, forsaking the human realm. Do it, Feyre, my father whispered from behind me. Go. I didn't look at him as I said, live where? Every inch of Prythian is lethal to us. I'd be better off dying tonight than living in pure terror across the wall until I met my end in doubtlessly an even more awful way. I have lands, the fairy said quietly, almost reluctantly. I will grant you permission to live there. Why bother? Perhaps a fool's question, but you murdered my friend, the beast snarled. Murdered him, skinned his corpse, sold it at the market, and then said he deserved it, and yet you have the nerve to question my generosity? How typically human, he seemed to silently add. You didn't need to mention the loophole. I stepped so close to the fairy's breath that the fairy's breath heated my face. Fairies couldn't lie, but they could omit information. The beast snarled again. Foolish of me to forget that humans have such low opinions of us. Do you humans no longer understand mercy? He said, his fangs inches away from my throat. Let me make this clear for you, girl. You can either come live at my home in Prythian, offer your life for the wolves in that way, or you can walk outside right now and be shredded to ribbons. Your choice. My father's hobbling steps sounded before he gripped my shoulder. Please, good sir, Feyre is my youngest. I beseech you to spare her. She is all, but whatever he meant to say died in his throat as the beast roared again. But hearing those few words he'd managed to get out, the effort he'd made, it was like a blade to my belly. My father cringed as he said, "Please." "Silence!" the creature snapped, and rage boiled up in me so blistering it was an effort to keep from lunging to stab my dagger in his eye. But by the time I had so much as raised my arm, I knew he would have had his maw around my neck. "I can get gold," my father said, and my rage guttered. The only way he could get money was by begging. Even then, he'd be lucky to get a few coppers. I'd seen how pitiless the well-off were in our village. The monsters in our mortal realm were just as bad as those across the wall. The beast sneered, "How much is your daughter's life worth to you? Do you think it equates to a sum?" Nesta still had Elaine held behind her, Elaine's face so pale it matched the snow drifting in from the open door. But Nesta monitored every move the beast made, her brows lowered. She didn't bother to look at my father, as if she knew his answer already. When my father didn't reply, I dared another step toward the beast, drawing his attention to me. I had to get him out, get him away from my family. From the way he had brushed away my knife, any hope of escaping lay in somehow sneaking up on him. With his hearing, I doubted I'd get a chance anytime soon, at least until he believed I was docile. If I tried to attack him or fled before then, he would destroy my family for the sheer enjoyment of it. Then he would find me again. I had no choice but to go, and then later I might find an opportunity to slit the beast's throat, or at least disable him long enough to flee. As long as the fairies couldn't find me again, they couldn't hold me to the treaty, even if it made me a cursed oath breaker. But in going with him, I would be breaking the most important promise I'd ever made. Surely it trumped an ancient treaty that I hadn't even signed. I loosened my grip on the hilt of my remaining dagger and stared into those green eyes for a long, silent while before I said, "When do we go?" Those lupine features remained fierce, vicious. Any lingering hope I had of fighting died as he moved to the door. No to the quiver I'd left behind it. He pulled out the ash arrow, sniffed, and snarled at it. With 2 movements, he snapped it in half and chucked it into the fire behind my sisters before turning back to me. I could smell my doom on his breath, and he said, "Now." Now. Even Elaine lifted her head to gape at me in a mute horror. But I couldn't look at her, couldn't look at Nesta, not when they were still crouched there, still silent. I turned to my father, his eyes glistened, so I glanced to the few cabinets we had, faded two yellow daffodils curving over the handles. Now. The beast paced in the doorway. I didn't want to contemplate where I was going or what he would do with me. Running would be foolish until it was the right time. "The venison should hold you for 2 weeks," I said to my father as I gathered my clothes to bulk up against the cold. "Start on the fresh meat, then work your way through to the jerky. You know how to make it." "Feyre," my dad breathed. My father breathed, but I continued as I fastened my cloak. "I left the money from the pelt on the dresser," I said. "It will last you for a time if you're careful." I finally looked at my father again and allowed myself to memorize the lines of his face. My eyes stung, but I blinked the moisture away as I stuffed my hands into my worn gloves. When spring comes, hunt in the grove just south of the Big Bend in Silver Spring Creek. The rabbits make their warrens there. Ask Isaac Hale to show you how to make snares. I taught him last year. My father nodded, covering his mouth with a hand. The beast growled in his warning and prowled out into the night. I made to follow him, but paused to look at my sisters, still crouched by the fire, as if they wouldn't dare to move until I was gone. Elaine mouthed my name, but kept cowering, kept her head down. So I turned to Nesta, whose face was so similar to my mother's, so cold and unrelenting. Whatever you do, I said quietly, don't marry Thomas Mandray. His father beats his wife, and none of his sons do anything to stop it. Nesta's eyes widened, but I added, bruises are harder to conceal than poverty. Nesta stiffened, but said nothing. Both of my sisters said absolutely nothing as I turned toward the open door, but a hand wrapped around my arm, tugging me into a stop. Turning me around to face him, my father opened and closed his mouth. Outside, the beast, sensing I'd been detained, sent a snarl rumbling into the cottage. Feyre, my father said, his fingers trembling as he grasped my gloved hands, but his eyes became clearer and bolder than I'd seen them in years. You were always too good for us. Good for here, Feyre. Too good for us. Too good for everyone. He squeezed my hands. If you ever escape, ever convince them that you have paid the debt, don't return. I hadn't expected a heart-wrenching goodbye, but I hadn't imagined this either. Don't ever come back. Yikes, my father said, releasing my hands to shake me by the shoulders. Feyre, he stumbled over my name, his throat bobbing. You go somewhere new and make a name for yourself. Beyond, the beast was just a shadow, a life for a life. But what if the life offered as a payment also meant losing 3 others? The thought alone was enough to steel me, anchor me. I never told my father of the promise I'd made to my mother, and there was no use explaining it now. So I shrugged off his grip and left. I left the sounds of the snow crunching underfoot drive out my father's words as I followed the beast to the night-shrouded woods. It's gonna get so good in chapter 5. I may be back tomorrow to read chapters 5 and 6. But this book is so good, and it was so fun talking about it on the podcast. And I can't wait to head into Prythian with Miss Feyre and the Beast. Hope you have a lovely night, and we'll talk soon.